So we've got a couple of important areas in the vote, and we've got two speakers to speak sort of in those two areas, I think is what they're going to look at. So we've got Sam Marsh, who you can see has joined us from Sheffield, and we've got Robyn Orfitelli. Did I get that right? I did. And she's come to talk about pay and all the other bits around the pay vote as well. There's a big list of things in that one that she'll talk to us about in a moment. Now, the plan is that they're going to do talks each, about 10 minutes each, something like that, and then we can get into questions afterwards. So unless it's a burning question in the middle of the talk, if you can hang on to it till the end, we're going to give you every opportunity to ask questions later. As I say, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to take us through, first of all, the USS bits.
Yep, great, thank you. So yes, thank you very much. Very nice to be here. First trip to Cardiff, and thanks to Woon Wong who put me up last night, which was great. So yeah, USS. Now, as you can see, I'm one of UCU's elected negotiators on USS, and I have been for a year and a bit. I wasn't there during the time of the strikes, but I joined last summer. So what I'm going to give you is a brief overview of what's happened recently, what's coming up, why we need to be doing what I think we need to be doing, and then, yeah, the rest will have to be in questions. So, USS. Now, just a very brief recap for those who are sketchy on this. USS is the pension scheme that's shared across universities UK-wide. It's a defined benefit scheme, which means that, or it's predominantly defined benefit, which means that when you put money into this scheme, what you're buying is a guaranteed income in retirement based on how many years you work and your salary during your time in work. And of course, a couple of years ago now, there was a valuation that showed, that purported to show this scheme in trouble. Employers responded by saying, well, we're going to have to close the scheme in its current form and swap it for what they call a defined contribution scheme, which is a very different beast, where money gets put into a pot, invested on your behalf, and whatever it gets to by the time you retire, you get. So there's no security there because the outcome is completely uncertain. Some generations will do much better than others, all sorts of things. I'm sure many of you here were on strike when that happened last year. Now, those strikes were ended when the employers agreed firstly to take off the table the defined contribution proposals and to go back to the scheme as it was, but also, and this is a really important part of it, they agreed an independent assessment of the valuation, because we maintained all along as UCU, and I would guess lots of you as scheme members, if you were stood on the picket line, maintained that the valuation wasn't a fair assessment of the health of the scheme. That if you like, the books had been cooked, this scheme was healthier than was being shown. So we wanted an independent assessment, and many of you may have voted in favour of hearing what a panel of experts said. So this report from the joint expert panel came out about a year ago. And I think many of us were surprised just how much it vindicated everything the union had been saying about the health of the fund. It contained plenty of criticism for how the employers had reacted to events, plenty of criticism for those running the pension scheme in terms of how they'd framed things, criticism of the way the pensions regulator had intervened in the story, but no criticism of the union's position on this. So I was there at the Joint Negotiating Committee, which is the formal body that discusses changes to the scheme, at USS headquarters in London on Threadneedle Street, when this report was released by the chair of the panel, Joanne Seegers, and the relief around the table was clear. We saw this as an end to or at least an end to the current turmoil over the scheme. The employers, you could see, also saw this as a way out for them, because the findings were that contribution levels wouldn't need to rise much in order to keep the scheme open in its current form. And it looked like a negotiated solution would follow fairly swiftly from that. But unfortunately, we're here today because those running the pension scheme basically didn't agree with what was in this report. And over the subsequent 6 to 9 months, they gradually dropped one by one the recommendations that were included in this report. And as a result, what's happened? Well, they've embarked on yet another valuation of the scheme. So the valuation that was under contention a year and a half ago got filed unamended, and with it, on paper, a big deficit and contribution rates that would have to go up. But the plan from USS was to file another valuation based on the market data a year later, so at March 2018, which would intercept the effects of the previous valuation. So, the 2018 valuation has been conducted. In doing so, USS eventually reverted right back to their old methodology. They rejected all the recommendations that was in the Joint Expert Panel's report. And what do they find? Well, it's a similar picture to a couple of years ago. They found a big deficit. Now, this deficit is lower than last time round, but that's because their investments have outperformed their pessimistic assumptions in the intervening year. So there's a certain amount of irony there. They also found that contribution rates have to go up, and they're saying, so this is the member rates for employers also have to go up, but they're saying members will from this October have to pay 9.6%, and in 2 years' time, in October 2021, that will have to rise to 11% to fund the current benefits. Okay. So, and that's, as I say, based on the old methodology, nothing's changed in terms of how they've been conducting the valuation, which pretty firmly contradicts what the Joint Expert Panel recommended. So, what's happening? Well, UCU are not at all happy with the situation. I think perhaps that's an understatement. I mean, we went on a painful strike. We got an agreement for an independent assessment of the situation. The independent assessment came back almost wholly vindicating our position, but then it's been ignored. And because of that, we're being asked for more money into the scheme. So we're balloting members, our members for strike action. Some of you will be UCU members. I guess many of you will be. Some of you may not be and are here for an update. Why are we resorting to this ballot? Well, I'm a member of the negotiating committee. I'm one of the negotiators for UCU, and I've been at, I think, all the negotiation meetings over the last year and a bit. And it's been quite clear to me that this is all about power imbalances or power balances. And when I first joined the committee in the summer of 2018, I think I'd go as far as to say that UCU were top dog in the room. So there are three main parties. There's us, there's the representatives from the employers, Universities UK, and then there's the people who run the pension scheme, USS. So Universities UK had been stung by the strike action and were keen to listen and to find a way to avoid further strikes. USS, by the time of the Joint Expert Panel report in September, were really on the back foot. They'd been strongly criticised in how they valued the fund. And there was a point at which UCU at least seemed to be in the driving seat. Unfortunately, what happened over the next 6 to 9 months was a kind of story of that situation eroding, with employers gradually stopping listening to our opinion, and with USS gradually getting more confident and one by one shedding recommendations from the report. I mean, in terms of where things were last October, we were shown the valuation of the fund if it followed, as at March 2018, if it followed the recommendations from the report, which would have shown no deficit and a contribution rate of something like 25.5%, which was even lower than when we started the dispute. That's total contributions, which were previously 26%. So we were shown that as a kind of starting position, and then gradually USS, rather than just outright rejecting things at the start, kind of chipped away, and one by one these recommendations went. So what's needed now is a huge shift in the balance of power. The employers are no longer listening to us. They're telling us that the sensible option is to go ahead with the plan that was on the screen earlier, and that the Joint Expert Panel will be writing a follow-up report, which is true. That's due either later this month or early next month. And the sensible approach is to suck up those contribution increases and wait to see what the Joint Expert Panel says, and wait to see if USS take notice of it this time. There's some sniggers in the room, and I would join you if I wasn't stood at the front. But because there's absolutely no sign that doing what we've done in the past and wait for a report and wait to see if it's implemented will have any effect. What's needed right now is a shift in the balance of power so that we can start being listened to. One of the important reasons is the basis for the next valuation. We've only just had one, but a 2020 valuation will so the basis for it, the methodology for it, is being set right now. Next month, a working group is being established, or the first meeting of a working group will occur to discuss the methodology to use in the March 2020 valuation. If we wait until that methodology is set and we see a draft valuation, we're right back into the thick of where we were at the end of 2017 with huge problems. We need to intercept and be listened to at the point that that valuation is being, the methodology for that valuation is being formed. The second JET report, as I said, is imminent. Now, we don't know what it's going to say, and I haven't got any hints on what it's going to say. I very much hope what they report this time is in line with what they reported last time. In fact, I would go so far as to say there's a lot more evidence that there's some funny stuff going on at USS than there was last time. Some of you may know about the suspension of the UCU trustee director, Jane Hutton, for asking awkward questions, or it seems to be it's to do with the fact that she was asking awkward questions. There's a lot that they could talk about, and we'll find out what's in that report shortly. But anyway, that report, whatever's in that report, we need to be listened to for our view on what it says and what needs implementing as a result. Now, some are tempted to think that wait and see is the way to go here, and I was glad there were some sniggers earlier when I sort of touched on this ground. We've been waiting and seeing a long time, and it hasn't worked yet. If we wait until the valuation is for the 2020 valuation is fixed, and we get to autumn next year and we're told that contribution rates are off the scale, and employers, I've no doubt employers will be preparing for a valuation that shows large increases and thinking about what they're going to do this time to downgrade the scheme. They probably won't go for exactly what they did last time, but they will be thinking about ways to try and push the risk of the scheme onto us instead of them. So my view, as someone who's been close up for a long time, is a wait and see approach would be a disaster. And then this one, employers can afford to pick up the costs. Now, I know there's issues in Cardiff, and I've been talking to Adam earlier, who's been looking at these finances very closely. However, the story is the same as the story nationwide, which is, and it's really striking visiting your campus. The priority is on building, and that's hammering your finances hard, and the priority should be on the staff. They can afford to pick up the costs by choosing different priorities. There are building projects, I believe, that are planned that could be put on hold in order to make the room to pick up these costs. And I didn't manage to look, but the sector situation, Robyn will talk about later on, more and more money is being diverted away from staff costs into other aspects of universities' functions, usually depreciation linked to building and stuff like that. Robyn will show you a graph later, I think. Okay, so that's me done, and I'll ask for questions after Robyn's spoken. There's plenty more I could have talked about, but if you want to find me, I'm on Twitter. And there's a link here. I should make these slides available somewhere so you can click the link, but UCU wrote a thorough sort of about 8-page document outlining our position and why it's fair and reasonable and the right approach to ask for employers to pick up the costs that are coming. So the important point, this dispute is about intercepting things going wrong on the valuation. We're also asking employers to pick up those contribution increases because it's not right that they're there, and it's not right that we're being asked to pay them. Right, I'll stop there, and Robyn, if you're ready, how many minutes was that? That was probably too many.
14.
Oh, sorry. It was 12 yesterday. I did a similar talk yesterday, and I've got worse. Sorry.
Okay, is everyone able to hear me? I'm a shrimp, so I'm trying to not stay behind the lectern if possible, so it's not like a little hobbit talking to you back there. So I'm also at the University of Sheffield. I'm our vice president, and I'm part of the pay and working conditions negotiating team for the union as of May, our last Congress. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is the false and duplicitous austerity narrative that our joint employer is trying to impose on us. And this doesn't only impact pay, it's also an austerity narrative related to duty of care in terms of workload, caring at all about BAME staff and women, and also caring about casualized staff and the epidemic of casualization in this sector. So pay negotiating works a little differently, and I get asked a lot of questions about how it's formulated. So negotiating over pay collectively in the UK is done, there are 5 unions on the staff side who collectively bargain, which means that there is a spine established back in 2001 of 51 pay points that are set for every HEI in the United Kingdom. Now, a couple of these spine points have actually disappeared in the intervening years since 2001 because their pay increases, or actually really, as Sam said earlier, their pay decreases, because the pay increase they offer us every year doesn't keep up with inflation. So in real terms costs, every single year, our pay is getting cut. And because of this, some of the lowest points on this spine have actually fallen off because they are below the voluntary living wage. So let me show you, I want to go through 4 myths, 4 lies our employers tell us. And the first one will relate to, so here is spine points 2 through 20 of this year's pay offer. And what you can see if you just focus on the increase column is that at the very lowest pay point spines, so these would predominantly be our comrades in Unison and Unite on these pay spine points. They're actually getting a slightly larger pay increase this year of, on average, just above 3% if you consider points 2 through 20. And the reason that they are getting this increase, so that's good. Oh, great, they're getting an increase above inflation. The reason is the staff side unions demanded it. This is text from the employer's offer, and I'd like to read you one line. So they, points 3 through 16 are getting increases up to 3.65%. This will mean, this is very generous, this will mean that the hourly rate for the lowest point on a 35-hour week will exceed the prevailing voluntary living wage. Well, thank you. That's absolutely wonderful. However, for those of us in UCU, for those of us who are lecturers, who are professional services staff, we're only receiving a 1.8 pay rise this year. Now, RPI, which is a measure of inflation, so this is a way of measuring how your purchasing power changes every single year as the cost of things like houses and groceries and things like that change. RPI, does anyone know what it is as of July 2019? It's definitely higher than 1.8. It's 2.9. So we're getting a 1.1% pay decrease this year from our employer. Happy holidays. Now, all of these pay spine points are divided into different clusters called grades. And these are actually negotiated locally, and they can differ from institution to institution. So, for example, comparing Leeds and Sheffield, 2 institutions that we might think would be very similar in their approach to this, you can see that grade 7, so this for us, I understand that grade 7 here at Cardiff is a starting lecturer salary, so it's a little different. That would be spine point 37, and at my institution, that's grade 8. No? This is wrong?
Grade 6.
Oh, grade 6, it's the other direction. Okay, so for me, starting as a lecturer, I started in grade 8. So it is a slightly different grading orientation than what you have, but the pay spine points are still the same. So you can see, though, that they differ from institution to institution. So at Sheffield, point 28 is the bottom of grade 7, whereas Leeds, they've got a better deal. That 28 is in grade 6 for them. So these sorts of things are handled locally. And this actually brings me, the reason I've gone through all of this with you, is this brings me to myth 1. So the employer is giving us a 1.1% decrease this year. And what they say when we complain about that is they say, but every single year your salary goes up as you move up within your grade. No, yearly increments are not a part of your pay rise. What yearly increments represent is that when an employee is hired to do a job, every single year that they continue to do that job, they gain experience doing that job. This is an acknowledgement that if you were hired, for example, to be a lecturer, In the first year you lecture, you won't have the same level of experience that you do 5 years in. So, progression up to the contribution threshold for each grade, reflecting the growing experience and skill of the job holder. Now, the very fact, if we go back and look at this, notice that grade 7 right here tops off at spine point 39. If you hit 39 and you then don't get promoted beyond that, you will never get those yearly increments. And this is one way that we can see in this scale, this is not a pay rise because you can hit ceiling. And I don't know how many colleagues we have from professional services here today, but this is something that professional services staff know all too well because of the huge problems in the sector with not having promotion opportunities for those in professional services. So hitting a ceiling and not getting those incremental rises every year is a huge problem for half of the staff at the university, one incomplete group. So yearly increments are not a part of your pay rise. The employer needs to stop claiming this. It is false. Number 2, the employer likes to claim, no, really your pay isn't that much worse off than it was last year or the year before or 20 years ago. And that's just, demonstrably false when you start to look at the numbers. So if we compare, again, so this is using Sheffield points here. So grade 30, point 37 on the pay scale would be the starting lecturer pay. And if we look at 2013-14, this would have been 37,000, okay, approximately, and change. 3 years later, starting in 2016, it's gone up to 39,000. Oh, so that's an increase. Great, it looks like it is. These are the types of numbers the employer will show you. If we go down to this year, somebody starting this year will now be making 41,500. But the instant that we correct for inflation, now we see that somebody starting in 2019, if we compare them to that person starting in 2013, there's a loss of 2,252 pounds per year of purchasing power. And this is just in the first year that they start off. The situation actually gets worse and worse because it compounds every year. So for the person starting in 2019, because they're going to, unless the employer changes their pattern, because they're going to continue to see these real terms pay decreases every single year, the curve of their salary is much more shallow in terms of its increase than even somebody starting just as recently as 2013. Now, what does this mean for us? It means that if you, for instance, are a professor right now, and so you've been in academia for quite a while, perhaps you're not feeling these pay decreases that much. Perhaps it's not impacting you that much. And I understand that feeling. But for those of us who are just starting in academia, or for our PhD students who might start in academia next year or the following year, these types of cumulative impacts have a real consequence for their ability to purchase property, to start a family, afford rent. I mean, these are huge and cumulative impacts that are just going to continue getting worse. And now when we add on top of this, casualized contracts. So this is just if you are lucky enough to get a permanent job right out the gate. What if you had to spend 5 years or 10 bouncing from job to job, not sure that you're going to even be able to stay in academia, not making enough money to have any sort of savings? It adds up. What if you are somebody who is systematically disadvantaged for promotion opportunities? What if you're a carer? Now, carers, we know, are disproportionately female members of staff. What if you decide to have a child? We know, systemically and societally, that disproportionately is the childbearing partner who ends up taking more time off when a child is born. Given this, and this impacts your promotion opportunities, and the employer is not willing to address how this impacts promotion opportunities. So suddenly, just even the generational pay inequality, which is bad enough by itself, is exacerbated by issues of race, gender, and casualization. And that brings me to workload. There is a workload and stress and mental health epidemic across this sector, as I know you are very personally aware. Every single hour that our employer adds on to our contracts each year, or not to our contracts, excuse me, to our workloads each year, is not only an additional hour that is chipping away at our mental and physical health, but it's also chipping away at our ability to support our families and to support ourselves. We're not on hourly paid contracts, but if you divide your salary by the number of hours that you're working now, is even compared to the number of hours you were working 5 years ago, this problem is exacerbated even more. So we can also see a huge shift in the reliance on casualized labor in the sector, which really highlights what I was just saying. If you look at, you add up the number of total staff from 1994-95 and then look at the proportion that was part-time and compare that to 2017-18, across this sector we are now at 1/3 of staff as a whole on casualized contracts. There are some institutions like Oxbridge that are even up to 50% in some of their colleges. This is absolutely unacceptable. Now, I showed you, actually before I move on, I showed you what the employer's offer was on pay. I've said nothing about what the employer's offer is on workload, casualization, or gender and ethnicity pay gaps, and there's a reason for that. They have no offer. There is nothing. I won't dignify what they wrote to us with actually describing it. Actually, I will. On workload, they've agreed to look into the problem. I sat there at a negotiating meeting where they were completely unaware of a report from the Higher Education Policy Institute demonstrating with longitudinal data what a crisis mental health is in our sector due to workload. Unaware of it. They sat there and said to us, these are local problems at only some institutions. They should be dealt with locally. No, you don't deal with a UK-wide epidemic by sending aspirin to one institution. You create policies to try to address this. We just want at this point for the employer to be willing to talk about negotiating on workload, and at this point they're not willing to. On gender and ethnicity pay gaps, they've now published a report. It's 2019 and our employer has finally learned the word intersectionality. But they certainly aren't making any recommendations for actions of how they could combat these things. There are a lot of concrete actions we'd like the chance to negotiate with our employer over. Better parental leave, better promotions opportunities are just two of them. There are lots. But we don't even have the chance to negotiate with them because they routinely come back to Jinches and say, that's outside of the purview of this negotiating body. It doesn't impact pay. Well, it's called a gender pay gap. It absolutely impacts pay, and it's absolutely part of the working conditions that impact our entire sector. And on casualization, yeah, they have absolutely, they just want to form a task group to continue to investigate how much of a problem this is. We in UCU know how much of a problem this is. We've had the anti-CAS community working for over a decade, not only demonstrating what a problem it is, but then developing concrete solutions for ways that this sector could solve that problem. We are past the point of wanting to just debate this with our employer, wanting them to gather information. We're at the point where we have to do whatever it takes to demand that they show a duty of care to the tens and thousands of people who are impacted by these issues. You will know this very well here, that expenditure on staff is falling. And it's falling, this is a sector-wide report from HESA, the Higher Education Finance Statistics. And it shows a decrease of from just over 58% back in 93-94 to just over 54%. Now, 4% might not sound very much, but when you start to get into the sizes of budgets that we're talking about an HEI having, this has a huge impact. When we look at individual universities, we find a very similar trend. So there's a similar trend happening at Sheffield, my institution. Just yesterday at Goldsmiths, Sam and I were looking up data. And there was a 5% drop at Goldsmiths from just a decade ago to now in their staff expenditure. I've seen data on the Transforming Cardiff earlier today, and not only is there a slight fall in staff expenditure that's been happening, there's a planned acceleration in drops on staff expenditure over the next 5 years, or next 3 years. This is unacceptable. We know that the money's there. As Sam alluded to earlier, it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of deciding that actually human beings are more important than buildings. Myth number 4. They like to say that they can't afford to increase our pay. Every single year except for one, since 1993, our sector has had an overall surplus. Now, the picture gets much more complicated when you look at individual institutions because all of them have a different financial profile. There are institutions like mine, which similarly are in a very good financial position. They could afford just themselves to increase our pay. Then there are institutions like yours who currently are in an okay financial position, but there are rough waters looming ahead. Why? Because of choices being made by the management of this institution. Cardiff can afford to increase your pay if they choose to actually prioritize staff instead of prioritizing buildings. And it truly is as simple as that. However complicated the underlying figures are, that's the take-home message. So where do we end? The same thing that Sam talked about, this false narrative being fed us by USS, this misuse of financial methodology to claim that we can't have the same pensions benefits that we used to have. This is an austerity narrative. It's the same austerity narrative that our employer is feeding us over pay. It's the same one that the government is feeding us in terms of public benefits. And it's the same one that's leading our employer to completely deny their duty of care over issues like casualisation, workload, and equalities pay gaps. We're at the point where we can't afford to take a wait-and-see approach on any of the 5 issues that we're balloting over. We're at the point where we need to be out there demanding that the employer acknowledge that they are responsible for us. So I hope you will vote yes, yes on both of your ballots. Yes, 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 yes. Thank you.
Another 14 minutes probably.
It was 16, I got worse too.
Is it? Okay, nice. We've still got 20 minutes or so for questions.
Right, okay, so the question is, what's the benefit, or paraphrasing, what's the benefit for employers of the changes that are coming in, and what's the benefit for USS? Well, there is no benefit for the employers in what's come out of this valuation. They wanted the same thing as us when the Joint Expert Panel's report landed a year ago. The problem was, and I've said this at other places as well, the people that we're dealing with who represent the employers are not activists in any sense of the word. And when things aren't going the way they want them to, they write a letter that expresses disappointment instead of calling out shameful behaviour by the pension fund. Now, so they think they've done everything they could and have got as far as they could have done. Having been there for the last year, I know that if I was in their position, that there would have been a whole load of things that could have been done differently. I was there and watched them take this kind of lacklustre approach. In terms of what's in it for the pension scheme, well, this is a difficult one to answer. There is no love lost between me and the chief executive of USS. I think there is a huge amount of ego involved. I think there's a huge amount of reputation involved. I'm sure there's a huge amount of social networks and the finance professionals in the City of London involved. This is the way the pension industry does things, and this is the way this pension scheme will do things, and they don't need to be told differently by a bunch of academics asking awkward questions. So that's part of the story. Almost certainly there's money involved somewhere. In some sense, if you end a defined benefit scheme, and turn it into a scheme that's a bit more like a defined contribution scheme in some way. You could maybe start offering the same pensions to other bits of the sector. You could probably grow your empire. All these kind of things are tied up in there somewhere. I don't have a definitive answer, but that's the closest I can get. It might become clearer with time, and I'm sure you'll still would still like to ask the same question again. And I would like to know precisely the motivations of those involved as well. I'm sure they're more complicated than the answer I just gave. So the question is, would the CEO of USS, that's Bill Galvin, come and give a similar talk to Cardiff UCU? So if the question is, would you be able to get him here to talk? Possibly. If he got here, would he give the same talk that I gave? Certainly not. Right. Well, in fact, there was a briefing that a webinar that Bill Galvin and Guy Coughlin, who's the Chief Risk Officer at USS, gave back in, I don't know, February, it seems like, sometime around there. My guess is that's still online, and if you want to hear it directly from Bill and Guy, then you could listen to that. I think it is. So I can tell my story now, which is how I got involved in this in pensions. In 2014, there was a dispute over the same issue. The valuation was showing a problem, and the scheme would have to change. I knew very little about pensions at that point, but as a mathematician, I thought time to start getting interested. And there were lots of mathematicians writing things. For example, Jane Hutton, who's the USS trustee, who's now been suspended, was at that time not a trustee of the scheme and questioning things. And I read what she wrote. And I thought that as there was messages coming from the union, messages coming from the employers and the pension scheme. I presume the truth was somewhere in the middle. I wanted to hear both sides of the argument, thought the truth was in the middle. The more I've learnt about it, the more I have become convinced that the truth is the story that I've laid out to you today. And I didn't start believing that. I believed that in time. By the time you've got an independent assessment of the scheme, chaired by a well-respected industry figure like Joanne Seegers, with nominees from UCU and from UUK, 3 from each side, who are distinguished in their fields. The UCU side is predominantly academics, the UUK side is predominantly industry people, who unanimously back a report saying essentially the story is pretty much as the union has been telling it. I think it's good to listen to what Bill and Guy have to say, but please look for all the times that they appear to be holding back information or finding it difficult to give you the full details. So I started, sorry, I talked too long, and I'm sure there's questions for Robyn as well, but in 2017 I started 2 years ago with a petition saying USS must show its workings. As an academic, all I wanted to see was the data behind their valuation. 2 years later, we still haven't seen that data. Jane Hutton has been suspended for asking for that data. This is what we're dealing with. Yep, absolutely. So the question is, can I say anything on the role of the pensions regulator in this story? And yes, I can. So there's been various letters that have been that are publicly available. Some were meant to be public, some leaked out of the system somewhere, and you can read. And it's true that the pensions regulator is putting pressure on USS to increase the contribution rates to fund the same benefits. So earlier this summer there was a meeting between UCU, Universities UK and the pensions regulator, with USS not present, to discuss the situation. That's the first time I've met with them directly. The impression I got from that meeting, and the impression that's in some of the letters, is that they are, I would say, almost hungry for evidence. And getting, it seems they're getting as frustrated as other people are with the lack of evidence that's coming out of USS. So a discussion that we had with them involved them saying, we would like UCU to come and present to us with the position as you see it and the evidence that you've got that backs up your position. We want to understand your position properly. And they said that they are aware that arbitrary judgments won't cut it for an academic community. That academics want to see evidence-based decision making, and that's what they want out of this as well, essentially. So it's a mixed story in terms of, definitely there's pressure on USS to up the contribution rates, but there's also frustration that they don't have access to the sort of to the level of detail, and they're encouraging USS to provide to the stakeholders the level of detail that the stakeholders want to see. and they're not giving it. So time will tell, but my impression from meeting them was that, so now we've got UCU and Universities UK kind of on the same page in terms of supporting the Joint Expert Panel report. We've got the Joint Expert Panel that have made that report and we're behind. We've got the regulator saying we're happy to talk and we want to talk about the evidence behind it and come to sort of a shared understanding. In the middle, we've got USS. And so that's my view, having been there. Yeah. So I hope that answered the question. Okay, so good question. The question is about the suspension of Jane Hutton, the UCU director from the USS board. How can that be possible, and is there any legal recourse we can take? Well, I think there's some knowledge of the legal situation in Cardiff here. You've got members of the Academics for Pension Justice group that have been looking at the legal case. I don't know how much they're going to touch on what's happened with Jane Hutton. In terms of the reasons for the suspension, I think Jane would say she is also, and I've got to be careful about what I say, but I think she is unsatisfied. She doesn't think she's been told properly why she's been suspended. The suspension happened in around May or June time and has now been running on 3 months. Well, more than that. How many months has that been? Anyway, it's been a number of months. I don't think whatever investigation that would be needed to look into whether she's broke some kind of code of conduct or whatever would have to take this long. And she's now missed all the key decisions with relation to the 2018 valuation as a result of being suspended. And in fact, worse, her term comes to an end at the end of October. This year, that's 4 years, and that's the end of her term. Now, she may be able to reapply for the position, and it is fundamentally a decision for UCU who gets appointed. So it may be she'll be reappointed, but I'm sure USS are hoping that they'll have seen the end, the back of Jane. How is it possible, and is there a legal recourse? I don't know how it's possible for it to be done this brazenly. I mean, I'm sure there are internal guidelines as to sort of conduct of directors, and I'm sure they will claim that they're following their processes. I don't believe a word of it, and I'm being recorded, but I don't care. I just don't believe it. It seems pretty clear that other people have broken this code of conduct. For example, David Eastwood, the chair of the trustee board, sat on an email from the pensions regulator which accused USS of misrepresenting the regulator's position. There's a question about the regulator a minute ago, and putting words in the regulator's mouth that they never said. Jane asked for whether the regulator had commented on this quote that they'd attributed to them. Not only did she not get shown this letter from the regulator, but it was hushed up in the terms of she wasn't even told this letter existed. That seems to break all sorts of codes for a chair of a trustee board. So I think there's a scandal that will come out in time in USS, but how it comes out and when it comes out, I don't know. But the closer I get to the decision making and the people involved, the more I think there's a scandal here that will explode at some point. I just wish it would explode before we have to strike.
What's your elevator pitch to our members who are more comfortable with evidence than taking industrial action?
There is no gain that employees have ever made that has not come off of the back of trade unionism, and more directly off of the back of potential strike action and potentially withdrawing our labor from employers. We have the evidence that we are right on these 5 issues. The only way, there is an inherent power imbalance between us and our employers. The only way that we will get them to back down on these issues is a strong mandate for strike action. That's the elevator pitch.
I won't. I think that was perfect.
Sorry. Okay, we still got a little bit more time to go. I think, yeah, we have
It's a question for Robyn. What exactly are our demands for those 4 things?
Yeah. For pay, the demand is RPI plus 3% at the moment. Now, if we really wanted to get back what we've lost, it would be RPI plus 20%. But I think that it was kind of decided that at a certain point, perhaps we should just try to start moving back in the right direction. In terms of workload casualization and equality pay gaps, to be honest with you, the number one thing that we need to get is a written acknowledgement from employers that that is within the remit of GINCHs, that we are able to negotiate on it. That would be huge, because right now, as negotiators, our hands are tied. They won't even acknowledge that there's a problem. Beyond that, though, there are a lot of demands that have either been made explicitly or could be made sort of implicitly in terms of this would be enough commitment to action from you to have us call off the strike. So in terms of casualization, what a low bar I'm about ready to set, but a commitment to not have 0 hours contracts with a clear definition of what constitutes a 0 hours contract, that would be this is horrific, that would be a huge step forward for our sector. On gender and ethnicity pay gaps, a commitment to actually have a sort of set of best practice principles in terms of guiding parental leave, so improvements to parental leave, commitment on a UK-wide level to actually address promotion inequity. In terms of things like, so one of the things I didn't talk about in the pay spine was sort of the exceptional pay points that when you hit the top of your grade, you can apply to get those exceptional pay points. We know that those are disproportionately awarded to cis white men. A commitment for a plan of action from our employer to try to make that more equal would represent a big step forward. And then in terms of workload, again, the bar is shockingly low, but a commitment to a sector-wide workload model that is based on hours instead of fictional workload units, which it is at many institutions and in many departments, to even model workload. There are many departments that do not, and to have a set of guidelines that mean that all of the work that we're actually doing is included as part of our job. And to have that there be an actual ceiling, that beyond that you need to hire more staff because that one person can't do that job. I mean, all of those things are things that, armed with the ability to negotiate with them, we would be fighting for. And some of those things are really low bars to try to get over. But once we've gotten over those bars, we can keep fighting for more improvements. So at least a commitment from the employer to talk about those things and signs that they have an idea of some of the things that we'd want to be talking about. That's what I would expect. That's what would get me to be willing to go back to the negotiating table with them. But it's not up to me. I represent members as a negotiator, so it would be what are the members willing to take as reason to stand down. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
But actually a very good point to finish on, because I'm going to be honest, it is 2 o'clock, and I'm sure they would, if your travel fits, so don't carry on taking questions later. But I know we did say this was a lunchtime session, so we should be honest and say you do have to leave, it is 2 o'clock, so thank you for coming along. We've covered an awful lot. Before you do go, can we just thank our two speakers?